Hello everyone, welcome again to another Keyforge stream. This is Eric, aka Justice Blinded, bringing you the second semifinal of the Adaptive Archon tournament of that the Decks of Keyforge is running. I'm having a bit of trouble with my webcam today, so I'm just going to show you the action, which is what you want to see anyway. Just real briefly, because the players have been waiting while I've been setting this up. We're going to discuss the decks extremely briefly, and then we're going to jump right into it. The semifinals is between LSY and Bhawk. LSY is going to be playing. LSY is going to be playing a deck called. I believe he's playing Drab Mirabelle. No, I'm sorry, he's playing Shin Fighter. So LSY is playing Shin Fighter. This is Shin Fighter. So Shin Fighter is a deck that has 2 reverse times in it, which is always interesting. It has 2 Ember Imps, a Restoring Guntus, and 2 Arises along with a Gateway. So LSY will be looking, among other things, to set up a Gateway, Arise, Restoring Guntus combination, possibly playing some Ember Imps as well. So it's got some strong control elements in Dis. It's also got some interesting things in Brobnar in terms of board control. I won't spend a lot of time going over this deck right now, but here it is right here, and if we need it, we'll pop back in. It's got 15 creatures, pretty balanced deck, 82 SAS. Again, in Adaptive, it's not about whether or not the deck is better, it's about how well you handle the deck, because you will switch decks after round 1, you'll play your opponent's deck on round 2, and then you'll bid chains on round 3 if that is something that if you get that far. So the other deck that's going to be played in this matchup is Bhawk's deck. Bhawk is playing Drab Mirabelle of the Queendom. Just taking a look at this, the first time I've seen these decks. So the things that jump out to me, it's obviously got a library access. It's got 2 rocket boots. And in terms of potential targets for rocket boots, he could be. Moon Cursor is an excellent target in this deck for Rocket Boots. He'll be looking to fight Steel 1. He can do that multiple times in a turn. He's got Umbra to fight Steel 1. So he's got some fight action that he's going to want to use. Doc Bookton Rocket Boots is also good. He's got 2 Hysterias, which could get pretty interesting with its counter synergistic, anti-synergistic with the Rocket Boots, but it's still got some things that that is interesting, and it's got some other control-y issues here. So we've been keeping the players waiting. Let's jump right into it and watch the action here. Trying to get in. Apologies for the delay. Let's try again. I don't know why this is doing this. I'm sorry. We're having some Crucible issues here. Okay. So I think we're up and ready. I'll tell them I'm trying to join the game. But it's having trouble because it hasn't started yet. Okay. Excellent. So we are in. Sorry for the technical issues there. Okay, so I told them good luck and thanks for waiting while we were sorting out our technical issues. So we are now going to see, some action here. I think we're both ready. We have LSY, aka Keith. He also goes by Third. So I'll probably call him LSY just because it's easier to remember with the screen names on board. And Bhawk on the other side. So we've got opening hands. Bhawk has drawn first player. Bhawk had an LA and Rocket Boots, but he decided to mulligan there. Probably right. You generally, especially since now you only get to play LA once, you don't really want to have just an LA with one other Logos card in opening hand. It can get kind of awkward, especially if you have ways to archive it. archive cards throughout the game. So he's going to start out with a Moon Cursor. He's probably looking to put Rocket Boots on the Moon Cursor and play Mother next turn, assuming that there are targets. We'll see if he's going to give him targets. He will give him targets. However, this is Skirmish Poison. He's going to play Anger to take out the Moon Cursor. And that's a good play if he's seen the deck, if LSY has seen Bhawk's deck. He knows that that there are threats with their double Rocket Boots floating out there is kind of the issue. So he's put Rocket Boots on Mother, and now we'll see Bhawk has, and now we will see what LSY we'll just say Keith, because I'm not sure if it's Lissy or LSY. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it. So we'll see what Keith's response is here. So Keith can archive a card, and then he can actually gain an Amber for the archive card, or he can archive 2 cards. He can play Reverse Time. If I'm in Keith's spot here, what I think I probably do is I archive a Restring Guntus. I would probably archive this rather than gain the Amber, and then I would Reverse Time. Okay, so he played Knowledge is Power to archive Restring Guntus, so he's then probably gonna, I'm guessing, archive Schuler. Either way, 6 in one, half dozen in the other, it's the same thing. So he did that, and then he'll play Reverse Time, and now in the draw pile he's got Lab Work and Knowledge is Power in the 4 cards, so he just drew those back again, and now he gets to archive more cards. Unfortunately, he didn't draw discards, because he didn't draw discards, so he's now going to be in an awkward position of maybe having to archive these Brobnar cards, but he'll probably play Brobnar first before he archives it. So Bhawk is... Ouch! Bhawk is forcing Keith to play Dis next turn. Keith has nothing, so he's just basically going to pass turn. Now, Bhawk didn't get very far with that turn. He prevented Keith from doing anything, but he didn't progress very far with that turn. But still, if you got to burn a Control the Weak, burning it for a free turn is never a bad situation for sure. So now we're back to Keith making a decision. I would expect, yes, he's going to choose Brobnar here, so that hopefully he can get some different cards to archive than the cards he has in hand. Plus, this allows him to clear the rocket-booted Mother off the board. It's just a weird sentence, which is exactly what he does with the Anchor. And now he's drawn into even more Logos cards, and he's drawn in an excellent card to archive, which is Gateway. Gateway is a great card to archive, especially when you're looking at a pure Logos hand here. Now he almost... so it's actually, he's got a decision here, right? Because he could pull Archive. He could pull the two disc creatures in Archive, the Restring Guntus and the Schuler, and play Gateway, then play those and try to get some sort of lock. He doesn't really have a lot of information about Bhawk's hand, though, so it would be difficult for him to make that sort of assessment. My instinct is that he will still probably go with Logos, opting to archive the Gateway and not go for the Restring Guntus lockout, but I can see that as a possibility. It really kind of depends on his play preference. The downside to doing that is that you would not really... You would draw no cards, because you would have 6 in hand, plus you'd have 3 changed from the Gateway. So my instinct here is what will probably happen is he will probably pick Logos and run all these out. The downside is that if he plays Titan Mechanic, he will then make his opponent's keys cheaper. But that's not a major factor, since he's not going to be able to take him off check anyway. He could play Knowledge's Power here for Amber, though. That would be decent. He's in Archive, I would assume Gateway. Interesting. Oh, no, he archived... What did he archive? I'm not sure what he archived. He discarded Dexter. He played Knowledge's Power to gain 3 Amber. Yep, that's fine. And then he's going to play or discard Mechanic. I guess if he intends on playing the Gateway next turn, playing Mechanic only hurts him. So he could discard a Mechanic. Although, if he discards a Mechanic, that's a pretty clear signal that something is up to Bhawk, and Bhawk may pick up on that signal. And he may choose to... interesting. He did discard the Titan Mechanic. Now, Bhawk, I mean, it's a hard thing to read, but it's possible in Bhawk's seat, if you saw that happen, you could know. Well, I mean, I guess you just play the creatures anyway. It doesn't really matter. But you might know in that situation that the Gateway play is coming. So now, for sure, based on the discard of the Titan Mechanic, the Gateway play has to come now. Especially since he's behind on board. So I'd expect him to pull Archives, call Dis, play Gateway, play Restringuntus, probably for something like Dis. The problem is if you play Restringuntus for anything other than Shadows, Seeker Needle can just kill Restringuntus immediately. So there's not a good Restringuntus play right now, currently. But there's definitely a bad one. And a bad one is not... Well, I guess Shadows is the obvious play. Unless you're just going for a one-turn stall. But I don't think he will. I think what he needs to do here is call Shadows. So play Ember Imp. Play Restringuntus. He's going to call Shadows. He's going to call Dis. Okay. So he's going for a one-turn stall. He has to know that's what's happening. Because the Seeker Needle can immediately kill Restringuntus. So that's an interesting choice. I'm not sure that I would have made that choice simply because you don't even know how much of a... Wait, what? How did he not... Banner of Battle! Oh, it is possible. Okay. So in the discussion earlier, I missed that a Banner of Battle been played. So that's how Restringuntus is not dead. So it is possible that he looked at this board and said... And he did the same thing I did, which he wasn't paying attention to the Banner of Battle. He thought he could Seeker Needle Restringuntus. But now it gets super interesting if somehow, well, he doesn't have an ability to. If he had an ability, let's say, to kill the Seeker Needle, it's a near total lock currently because he's called Dis with the Restringuntus, because he's got 5 cards in hand. But he called Dis because he looked at his discard and saw that Dis was overwhelmingly the house that he's likely to have cards in hand. So that's fine. And he also called Dis because he had a Banner of Battle in play. Now the problem is he's just going to call Shadows, Seeker Needle, and then Restringuntus is gone. I think you can make an argument here that you should play Reverse Time to get the Restringuntus back? Like, discard Reverse Time? Yeah, see, Bhawk is making a comment about Restringuntus and Banner of Battle, so my guess is that he didn't see that, or maybe he did and that was the only option. Probably was the only option, actually. So if he can get Restringuntus out of Graveyard, it can get super nasty, but by then he'll have dumped these cards. So I think what he'll probably do is, knowing that, he'll pivot to Brobnar and drop all this down, because his discard is Logos, right? So he has a Gateway Restringuntus play. But, yeah, he's just going to play Brobnar, drop a War Chest down, drop Valdir, and Headhunter out, and see what happens. Bhawk plays a Hysteria, he plays a Tentacus, he plays an Ember Imp, and he plays an Arise for Logos, setting up a big second turn with LA. That's a huge turn that's coming down the pipe with LA in hand. So, and the problem is there's also an Ember Imp on board, which Keith has no response to currently. He has a delayed response. Keith's best play here, he may not know it, but I think he might be able to figure out. His best play here is to drop 2 Ember Imps. And the reason why is it prevents this LA monstrosity from going off next turn, because all that could happen is he'd play an LA and play a creature, and then if he didn't specifically draw something like Twin Bolt or, let's see, is Twin Bolt in the deck? No. No, all the direct damage stuff is in Shadows. And then you have bounce stuff over here. Yeah, so we'll see if, yes, it looks like he's figured it out. Keith is going to play the Schuler double Ember Imp, which is a great play here because it's going to effectively delay Bhawk's massive LA turn until he kills a thing. Oh, so he's done something even more interesting. Oh, right, because the Ember Imp. Never mind. I was hypothesizing he was holding back an Ember Imp intentionally, but he didn't have a choice because there was an opposing Ember Imp on Bhawk's board. So Bhawk had this out. He can only play 2 cards. He played an Ember Imp and a card that can kill the Ember Imp. So this is like the battle of the Ember Imps here. He plays his own Lash. He plays an Ember Imp. He Schulers out the Ember Imp, and now he's effectively stopped the LA nonsense from going off. So Bhawk will probably not play LA here. He'll drop a Mother and something else like a Bookton or an Escatera would actually be very good. Yeah, so Escatera and Mother I think is the play. Yep, and then next turn he's got stuff to fight the Ember Imp with. And if he can kill the Ember Imp, then he can do this nonsense LA turn. But Keith knows that LA is in his opponent's deck, so he should be thinking about that possibility in the back of your head. It's getting down. There are 10 cards left in his draw pile. He has to be thinking that there's an LA coming at some point in time, and he knows by looking at the draw pile he's only seen 3 Logos cards played, 2 on the board, so there are 5 total, so there are 7 more Logos cards he has not seen. They're either in here or in hand, and one of them is LA, so he has to be kind of anticipating a massive LA turn, and as a result, he's in the lead, he's up a key, he needs to play to protect against the LA turn. So the dilemma he currently has is, does he call Dis just to Lash, right? And then that'll allow him to fight in here and next turn do all of that stuff. Or does he call Logos? It doesn't really seem to help. Like playing a mechanic isn't going to do anything. It's just going to make his forging easier. And dropping 3 Brobnar creatures is not terrible. Mostly because he knows he can't stop Ember Imp from being killed next turn. As a result, Keith is now thinking, well, if I can't stop him from doing what could be a nasty LA turn, what's my next best option? And so he's fighting in there. He's basically making Bhawk run. I mean, this is what's going to happen. He's going to run Escatera into the Ember Imp, and then he's going to go off on all this nonsense. So it's an interesting choice by Keith there to not board develop a little, simply because he knew that he left the window open, right? That he could not shut the window. In other words, he could not prevent the Ember from being killed. He could not prevent the theoretical LA nonsense from happening. And he got very lucky here, and that is that he drew no extra Logos cards off the LA, but he still went back to 5 Logos cards on board, and he's still back in check, and Keith can't really stop him other than Lash. So you kind of have to wonder if even this is best case scenario for Keith based on what was in Bhawk's hand, right? It's slightly worse than absolute best case scenario because he didn't know what his hand was blind, but it's still, this is best case scenario for Keith taking the line that Keith took last turn, and it's still not good. So it makes it reasonably clear that he probably should have just played the Brobnar cards and run out from there. But he definitely has to play the Brobnar cards now, and hope that he draws into something that's going to look like Amber Control, because otherwise, next turn, Bhawk can forge a key and then reap a bunch of times. So the one question I had, and maybe it was just an oversight. LSY said probably bad move before the thing. Yeah, I mean, he kind of sensed that it could have been an issue. But the one thing that I would have done differently if I were Bhawk, I would not put Booked in next to the mechanic, because if you forge for 5 last turn, you would have one left over without having to play the shadows out, and then um, you could just reap. You would be able to reap and put yourself in check and force Keith into a series of very bad choices, like in terms of not really great alternatives. Nonetheless, Bhawk does now have a second key, has played 2 Shadows cards, does have the things on board to deal with it. So it's really a tough position. Bhawk is bemoaning his luck, but realistically here, he's still in a dominant position because Keith doesn't have a lot of Amber control in hand. He has, in fact, no Amber control in hand. He has a Headhunter on board that he can use, but okay, there we go. So I missed that. Sorry, I wasn't scrolled all the way down. He played Keyhammer. That's actually very good. I must have missed where he had that in hand. Did he pull his archive? I don't know where he got Keyhammer from, but that's, if he already had it in hand, I just missed it. I apologize. But Keyhammer followed by Lash is a very good sequence because it actually prevents, it buys Keith an entire turn and prevents Bhawk from forging again, and he got a random card out of hand. Or no, I'm sorry, he just killed Umbra. Now this is interesting. So Bhawk is opting to cycle cards out of hand rather than applying pressure. I can't say I agree with this decision, especially since Bhawk had 2 phase shifts in hand. So the best play there was to just reap with his board and then play phase shift, because he only played. So he wanted to use Lash, which I understand, but unless he thinks Keith is going to key cheat, which I don't even think there are any key cheats in the deck, that doesn't make a lot of sense, because what he really wanted to do was he wanted to reap with all these Logos creatures, understanding that Keith is not playing Shadows, does not have anything like Too Much to Protect or anything that's going to punish mass steal. He wanted to reap with all these Logos, play the 2 phase shifts, then play the Creeping Oblivion and the Dust Imp that he played anyway, right? So that was what he wanted to do last turn. Instead, he's allowed himself to be in a position where this is probably not what Keith will do, but Keith still could go back to Disc, call Lash, and he still wouldn't forge and would have this extensive board. So this is just kind of it's a weird situation where now, well, he's going to play Reverse Time, and then he's going to play Reverse Time again, and he's going to give him a key. Now, I can't say I agree with that a great deal, mostly because, well, no, I take it back. I'm sorry, I didn't see this. It puts him on check, so he's on 6. So that's the reason he did it that way, which is fine. I still think I probably would have instead fought with this into something that he could kill, like Escatera, and then used War Drummer and played a couple more Brobnar cards. He was ahead at the time, but now he's in a very bad position because now he is forced to call. He's forced to call Lash, and he's got to put Tentacus here. Well, I guess he doesn't have to if he's lashing, but he should put Tentacus here because I guess he's banking on Bhawk maybe being able to take 1 Amber away and then play that, except that Bhawk is just going to Lash, archive a card, and then play Succubus. It's just going to be a battle of lashing. The problem with, we play Control the Weak. Oh, that's a problem. So that could be the game here. What does he have? No, that's it. That's unfortunate. So Keith had this reasonably in control of the mid game, but he's going to end up losing here, I think, if I'm reading this correctly. Why is he has to cover the Titan mechanic at least. I guess it doesn't matter because he's going to lose anyway, but he's just playing it out here. But obviously, if you had any shot of winning, you want to cover the Titan mechanic when your opponent's at 6. If you had a way to steal another Amber, but it's just too late, unfortunately. He looked to have it in control mid-game. Bhawk came out with a couple series of turns. Neither player was... You saw at the end there were several turns in a row where neither player was applying pressure to the other player in as hard as they could apply, right? There was both players could have applied pressure more directly to the other player in like a majority of the last 4 or 5 turns in that game. And if Bhawk had done that, he probably would have won earlier. If Keith had done that, I am not sure that he would have won. I had to go back and look. But there were a couple different turns where Keith wanted to board develop, probably, as opposed to doing the things that he did. Stalling is... If you can stall and advance your board position, then you are improving. If you can stall your opponent and advance your position, it's usually a decent play. But if all you're doing is stalling, unless you are dominantly in control and in check, that's usually not the most profitable situation to be in. It depends match to match, obviously, but it's not letting me join. Why is it not letting me join? Let's try this again. Okay, we're in. All right, so they're going to switch decks now. Bhawk's going to play Keith's deck. Keith is going to play Bhawk's deck, and we will see what happens. So again, Bhawk has drawn first player. This is the one thing that playing on the Crucible changes a little, because normally Bhawk would now have the option about who the first player is, and I think he would probably want to make Keith the first player. You usually want to go second if you have a choice, if there are no chains at issue. That strategy is going to change in the third game. We'll talk about that if we get there. But right now, Keith has mulliganed. Bhawk is perhaps contemplating an early Restringuntus play, but decides to mulligan there. Yeah, a turn 1 Restringuntus play is just super hard. Although if he found the turn 1 Shadows Restringuntus, that would be really gross. But that'll fall into the category of things that could have happened that we'll never know what would have happened. So he drops a Tenicus down. Keith is going to play some Shadows cards. Discarding Bad Penny. So you'll see that a lot in games. People will discard Bad Penny because if you don't have any sort of combo or recursion, to anything to combo off the recursion, then that can make a big difference if you don't have it. So meanwhile, we're back to Bhawk, who's twin bolted out Moon Cursor. Bouncing Death Quark. He archived Bouncing Death Quark. That's probably a good play. It draws him one fewer card than if he had played or discarded it. But Bouncing Death Quark is a pretty important card in this matchup. We didn't see it last matchup, but I think that's because Keith didn't draw it. But Bouncing Death Quark is going to be a major board leveler when we get there. So this is really going to be an interesting situation. Okay, So Keith is going to do... He's going to play this just to cycle his hand. He cycles back 2 discards. That's always frustrating when that happens. 2, 3, 1. And he, Bhawk is likewise, he's going to play Dexter instead of discarding Dexter. Play reverse time. I guess that's fair because if you discarded Dexter and then played reverse time, Dexter would just be back in your hand again. But it's probably okay to play Dexter here, even though when you play Dexter and you don't capture anything, it feels particularly bad, because then he's just like a card that you don't really love. He keeps recurring back and forth. But he's drawn into another, Bhawk is drawn to another 2/2/2 hand, which is the curse of RNG at this game for sure. So what's Keith thinking? Keith is considering whether he wants to try a 3-card, really it's a 2-card, because you play LA and then there are 2 more cards, a 2-card LA turn. That's not a great option. However, his only other options are playing Hysteria, which is not particularly amazing here, especially since you're bouncing a Dexter back to hand. They just replay it and capture, assuming you gain any amber at all, which actually he wouldn't if he played a disc turn. But he's going to go with Shadows. He's going to play a Moon Cursor. He's going to Reap, I guess. I don't think... Oh, no, he's going to trade with Tentacus and pass. Yeah, that's just a tough... I mean, they're tough decisions. Discarding into Rise and in Hysteria and just lashing into nothing doesn't really feel like a great turn. That didn't feel like a great turn either, but it might have been his best option. Unfortunately, he drew into no more Logos cards, so he's going to have to decide how long he wants to chain himself with these Logos cards in hand, hoping to draw into a couple more Logos cards for the trigger, and he's going to wait at least one more turn. So he's going to play... Does he play Hysteria here? I mean, I guess, right? I mean, you might as well play Hysteria. Yeah. Not a lot of downside there, because you're not even going to generate Amber this turn. Oh, he does play the Arise for Shadows. Okay. Alright, well, that does 2 things, right? It does give him a chain, but it gives him an easy turn to follow up with all these Shadows cards, and it gives him one more chance to draw into a couple extra Logos cards for the LA trigger. And meanwhile, Bhawk puts some Brobnar creatures on the board. Now, Bhawk is now in check. So the problem is that that Keith's plan, while, you know, a good one in a vacuum, is going to allow his opponent to get in check, to forge a key, but he really doesn't have much other choice here. So he's going to play the Shadows cards. He's going to only draw 2 more cards because he's going to lose his last chain right now. But the real question is... what does Bhawk do in response? He discards Bad Penny and draws 2 more Shadows cards. So we might be seeing... Now, that's when the discard of Bad Penny feels particularly bad, when you see the Pawn Sacrifice. And that's a good example of... Again, I'm not saying it absolutely was the wrong decision to discard Bad Penny there, but that's a good example of a situation where a guy is playing a deck, Keith is playing a deck, that he does not have that much experience with. And therefore... maybe didn't remember or wasn't counting on Pawn Sacrifice to possibly come up at some point in the future. There were 20-something cards left in the deck, so how many Pawn Sacrifices are there? Just the one, so I guess that's fair. Maybe it's a judgment call that would have been different, but maybe not. It depends. I guess we can ask Bhawk how often he discards Bad Penny in this matchup. But here comes the LA turn. He's going to attempt to... he's probably going to Rocket Boots the Dodger, I would guess. But he's not drawing into anything good here. That's the problem. Yeah. So, it's unfortunate. He got no LA hits there. And as a result, just drew the cards he would have drawn anyway. And that's when LA feels the worst. So here he's going to play... Shadows. Next turn. Meanwhile, Bhawk is... use the Crocag to take out Dodger, and then is going to play some Logos creatures. Bhawk is definitely in command of this match. Keith is going to need to do something very quickly. This is fun. Bhawk is actually in check with 3. So Keith really needs to do something about that. Keith cannot allow Bhawk to forge at 3 Amber. I've never seen that in a game before. He cannot allow that. So he's really got to. If I was him, I would probably play. Well, oh yeah, he's gonna play Shadows. So you got to pawn sacrifice the mechanic into something probably. I don't think you want to pawn sacrifice the Umbra, but it is only 2 power and this board is very big. So I can see pawn sacrificing the Umbra. But now if you pawn sacrifice anything other than the mechanic is going to stay on board. So you've now you have to pawn sacrifice the mechanic if you pawn sacrifice. Because if you don't, then you're going to give Bhawk a key. You absolutely cannot give him a second key here. Because if you pawn sacrificed either, he's got to do that. If he pawn sacrificed either one of the outside creatures, mechanic would be on a flank, and then he would be handing Bhawk a key for 3, which is just obscene. So he pawn sacrifices the Titan mechanic. And now Bhawk is still in dominant control of this board. Bhawk knows the deck that that Keith is playing. The real question is what outs does he have, and he really needs to get this gateway. That's what Keith is looking for right now, probably. And now Bhawk has solidified his advantage by playing a Schuler, an Ember Imp, and a Charette. He covered up the Titan mechanic, which I think is an odd choice given that he put himself at 5. If I were him, I would not have put the Schuler on the end there, covering up the mechanic, because that's just one more thing you're forcing Keith to respond to. So Keith is just in a rough spot here. I don't know what Keith does here, but I think you just have to play the most cards, which is Dust Imp, Ember Imp, and then Creeping Oblivion. You're trying to cycle the Gateway. He has not seen Gateway yet. There are 12 cards left in his draw pile. What did he archive earlier? I'm trying to remember. He archived... I'm totally... Sorry, I forgot what he archived. But he archived... I'm almost positive it was not Gateway. It was something else. So he's going to play Shadows, play Lights Out, and a Seeker Needle. He doesn't have to Lights Out the Ember Imp here, but he probably wants to. Because he would like to have a turn where he can play more than 3 discards coming up. So you probably want to Lights Out the Ember Imp, and then if you Lights Out the Ember Imp, you don't have to Lights Out this mechanic. I would probably Lights Out an Ember Imp and a Brobnar creature. Call it Headhunter. That would probably be what I would do. Because he's not going to Forge for 5 because he's at 4. So you Lights Out the Ember Imp and the Headhunter, and then you have at least... Yep, that's exactly what he does. So that's an excellent play. And then he plays the Seeker Needle. And now he's back to a situation where he can play 4 cards. So Bhawk is going to vomit a bunch of Brobnar stuff on the board. He's going to play the Headhunter, the Javelin, the Banner, all of the things. He's playing all of the things, which just solidifies his board advantage and also gives him the 5th Amber for Javelin. I'm trying to figure out how he got from 5 to... At any rate, I don't know how he got from 4 to 6 rather than 5 to 6. But however that happened, it happened. And now Bhawk is at 6. And we are now in a position where Bhawk's in check. LSY has to take him off check. Fortunately, he has a method to both board develop and take him off check, and that is by calling Dis, lashing, and then playing out all these cards. So we can play an Ember Imp. Interestingly, if he were to find, well, so unfortunately he's got creatures on board from all things. So if he plays the Ember Imp, he can get... What Keith is thinking about here is if I play the Ember Imp, I have a control the weak. Is there a house that can control the weekend that will protect the Ember Imp? And the answer, unfortunately, is no. Because he controls the weak, he could control the weekend to Dis, which turns out is probably his best play. But if he controls the weekend to Dis, the Javelin can always kill his Ember Imp anyway when he plays it. And if not, Schuler could attack the Ember Imp. So that's not... The Ember Imp is going to die. The question is, what's the most productive turn that he can have, or... in other words, what's the least productive turn he could force Bhawk to have? And the answer to that is he's got to play the Ember Imp, play the Dust Imp, Creeping Oblivion to purge anything, probably Charette, because it's Amber Control, and Mother, and, I don't know, Gorgonzoogle, probably, or Gongoozle, or, sorry, I always call that a cheese. So he calls Logos. Now, that's an interesting call. I don't know that I would have made that call. Mostly because there are Logos cards on board. Perhaps he's afraid of the opposing Ember Imp coming down, but he has stuff that can attack it. If he calls Dis, there's only one card there. I guess he could also be calling Logos because he's anticipating there are fewer Logos cards available. 4 in the deck, 2 on the board versus Dis, 3 in... discard. 4 in the discard, 2 on the board versus... 3 in the discard and 1 on the board. So we could think there's more likely to be discards in his hand. That's fair. I guess I would, just because there are 2 creatures on board that can attack, it's probably pretty similar. So he purged Charette and Gateway. That's fine. He got the Charette. Probably would have purged that, but it doesn't really matter. I don't know that it would have purged Gateway, mostly because you would like him to play Gateway right now, but he has an Arise, so I guess if he could somehow get Gateway back, you wouldn't want him to play it. So he's 100% going to Death Quark here. He'll Reap with the Logos creatures, and then I think he'll Death Quark him. Oh, he's fighting with the Logos creatures. This is interesting. This is very interesting. I guess he's just solidifying a board advantage. The reason why I probably wouldn't do this is I probably wouldn't waste time fighting with these creatures is because he knows that Keith's out to this situation, or at least chance of an out, is his own Gateway, which Keith actually just drew. So I think that, and he discards Bouncing Death Quark. Yeah, I think I would probably Reap there. Does Death Quark allows you... the Death Quark is only creatures. That's fair. You don't want to kill this creature. That's fair. He's absolutely... Keith 100% has to play Dis. Call Dis. Reap here. Trigger Lash at any point in time during the turn. Gateway. Discard Hysteria. Like, he's got to do that. Because there's too much on the board. He cannot allow this board to exist while Bhawk's at 9. Plus, lashing and forcing Bhawk to forge at 9 gives him a chance. It's not a strong chance at this point unless things go very well for him. But he has to get rid of this board. He cannot allow, like, 5 different things on board to Reap. 4 in Brobnar and all those other things. So, we'll see what happens. So he lashes. I would just Reap with the Imp. Discard Hysteria, play Gateway, I think. See if that's what happens. He's thinking. So what are the arguments for holding Gateway here? If you could make one, the arguments, I guess, would be that you don't want to take the chains. But it's, I mean, it's just, to me, it's pretty straightforward simply because interesting. So he played Hysteria rather than Gateway. That is interesting. Okay. So he found a line that I was not considering that may work for him, but it could be. What he's done is he's clogged Bhawk's hand, anticipating phase shifting into a Gateway next turn. So he could do phase shift Gateway. Okay. So he interestingly found a line. He not baited Bhawk. He didn't know what Bhawk had, but he's caused. This is going to be really interesting. So he's going to play phase shift Gateway, and then wipe the board of everything. That is a solid play here. He'll then play Titan Mechanic booked in, put the Rocket Boots on booked in. That's a really good play. So he baited him into playing all of his disc stuff because Bhawk knew that Gateway had not been played, and he had almost drawn the entire deck. But Bhawk had to either rest Renguntus for discs or for logos. So that's the best that Keith could have done. Unfortunately, he still finds himself behind in this position because now he's facing down a massive board of Brobnar creatures. A bunch of Brobnar creatures. That's like a tongue twister. So his play here is still almost certainly reap 3 times here, draw 2 cards, play Booked-In, play Escatera, and we can actually figure out what the last card in library is. You can do this at home too when you're playing against an opponent. If you can at least figure out what house it is, even if you haven't memorized their deck list. You just count the cards in discard, count the cards on board, and then obviously you don't have a perfect count if you don't know what's in hand. But so here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So he drew the last card and it was Umbra. He did it before we can get the count, but he drew Shadow's last card, and now he's going to draw. He turned over the deck and draw more cards. So the question here is he drew a phase shift. What do you want to phase shift in? I think you have to phase shift into probably a lights out. Otherwise, he's just going to call Brobnar and wreck your board. Yeah. What are you bouncing? I would bounce this. Yep. That seems fine. Bounce the thing that gains you Amber. Bounce the thing that destroys. So now he's going to call Brobnar. He's going to replay 2 creatures. Now, he almost instinctively called Brobnar here. I'm not sure that was the correct decision, but it still looks pretty fine blowing up the board. He's got to be careful, though, because if he completely blows up the board, then Krokag goes away. So by not threatening Amber, this is one of those situations where it may have been better to allow him to keep a board, because by not threatening Amber, what he's done is he's put Keith in a position where all Keith has to do is well, he's only got a Dexter in hand, right? Yeah. So all Keith has to do is, if he can avoid Crump, yeah, the correct play here. Oh, he clicked Logos. I think he probably did that by accident. Unfortunately, there's not a... Yeah, he can... So he's going to change his house to Shadows. He meant to call Shadows. The interesting thing here is, and it's hard to know this, right? But if you had count on what Bhawk was doing, the correct play with the hands face up on the table is for him to play Ghostly Hand and then discard 2 Umbras. The reason why is that Crump can kill one of the Umbras and then causing him to lose 1 and take him off check. Now, this is still a moderately risky play, especially if you're not paying attention to the cards as they come out. You don't know the cards that are left in his hand. But there's only 1 card left in the deck, so you can narrow the deck down to 7 cards. So you can pinpoint 7 cards that Bhawk has. And if you can do this, this is like where memorization and attentiveness plays a very big role. If you look at his discard pile, you see here are all the cards in discard pile. You know what cards are left. You know they're all logos plus one other card. And you know that in those logos cards, and forgive me because I don't know what the last card in draw, maybe it's Amber Control and none of this calculus matters. But if he can do all the calculus, he can figure out that the correct play is to discard, to play the ghostly hand, discard the Umbras, because then it would deprive him of targets, and Crump can't fight into Mechanic and still have the effect trigger, because Crump would be dead. So the only capture he'd have is Dexter, as is... Well, he can't fight in with Crump and play Dexter in the same turn, so it's still fine. So he's going to play Twin Bolt, he's going to play Dexter, and Keith is going to win this match. By the skin of his teeth. Okay. So that was a very good match. I'm just thinking about my advice at the end there to discard the Umbers. I think he can probably play the Umbers, but it's one of those considerations where you got to think about it. So Keith pulled out a win there. Very good on him for doing so. Look, the board looked very desperate. Situation looked very desperate earlier on, but now we are going to see some. We're going to see some chain bidding. Before they bid, my instinct is that Keith's deck is not worth more than 3 additional chains. Because that game was very close. The first game was reasonably close. I would not go above 3 on the chain bidding. Wait, so hold on. I'm asking them who brought the deck, because isn't that... Okay, so interesting. So I came in chat because I thought that Bhawk had opened the bidding on his opponent's deck, but in fact that was not the case. They had already bid and they passed, so they were close. So Keith made a decision that he would rather play his deck anyway because the games were close. So apparently, my evaluation of that deck being no more than 3 chains was close. In fact, it was even worse than that, and their evaluation was even worse than my evaluation in terms of not worse. Like they made a worse evaluation, but they didn't even think it was worth 1 chain. So we'll see what happens. We're going into the finals of Game 3. If I can get the thing to load, we'll try one more time. Here we go. There we go. DoK. All right, we are in. I don't know why it's doing this. They have 2 different games up. Okay. Why is it doing this? It keeps bouncing. I'm sorry. Once they actually get started, a game will be able to join very quickly. This is what Crucible is doing now. Here we go. Can someone hit start? Yes, we're in. Excellent. Fantastic. Apologies again for the technical difficulties. We have the games. They're both playing the deck that they brought. This time Keith is on the top of the screen, Bhawk is on the bottom of the screen. It's fascinating that neither person chose... Bhawk was forced to bid 0 chains as the person who brought the deck. Keith said, that's fine, you play your deck, I'll play mine. So just kind of a rematch of Game 1 with no chains. So this is very fascinating. This is uncommon in an adaptive final, but these decks do seem to be fairly closely matched. So we'll see what happens. It's not a guarantee by any means. that chain bidding was necessary. So both players have drawn their hands. Bhawk has drawn into a first turn LA run, well, his first turn, turn 2, LA run. He's got a phase shift in there, which is the best kind of LA run, which means he'll be able to play at least 4 cards. Even if he bricks completely, he'll play 4 cards and draw 4 cards. So we'll see what happens here. Keith mulliganed, and he's now determining turn 1 plays. I think you want to play a lab work to maximize the number of cards that you draw. So he's going to do that probably. I would guess. Wishing both of the competitors good luck. So he's going to play a Logos turn, play a lab work, Archive Anger, I believe that was. And here comes the LA turn from Bhawk. He did manage to draw 1 LA card of Rocket Boots. He's got 1 more card to play on a phase shift. He's probably going to play Dodger and he bricks. So he did get 1 additional card as a result. Still a reasonable LA turn. Unfortunately, he didn't draw into anything else, but he's got a nice Shadows turn set up next turn, assuming that Keith plays creatures, and it looks like Keith will be playing creatures. So Keith is probably going to play Dis, Tentacus, Schuler, discard and Arise. That's what I would expect to see here. I wouldn't expect to see any reverse time shenanigans, because you're just reversing a lab work and playing a Dexter, which feels bad when you're facing this board. You need to play something that has the ability to kill Booked in next turn if it survives, if the creature you're playing survives. So I would expect to see Discall, Tentacus, Schuler, discard Arise. We'll see if that's what Keith does. Well, okay, so that is what he's going to do. I was going to talk about Bhawk's next turn, but we'll get there in a moment. So that is precisely what Keith is going to do. He's going to lay down Tentacus, Schuler, discard and Arise. In theory. Does not discard Arise. Okay, so this is a good example of a constant debate in the game about whether or not you want to be holding cards in certain times. He's choosing to hold the Arise, and that's going to almost always backfire early in the game, because especially if, like, at that point, he's only holding the Arise to get these 2 creatures back anyway. So that's a good example of when this Arise has become a chain in your hand, and especially in the Nightmare scenario where Bhawk does the thing that we saw him do, which was, I'm talking like Pert Hapley now. The thing about the thing that he did was, it was the thing that he did. He played Lights Out, he bounced the 2 disc creatures, and so now the Arise is totally useless and an extra chain in hand, forcing him to... He played Dexter and Reverse Time. So this is kind of a feels bad start for Keith. Some of which is his own doing, but most of which is the fact that Bhawk has drawn into an excellent string of opening cards here and has complete control of the board. The card that Keith needs is Gateway. He needs a gateway to get himself out of this mess. And when you don't have a card in hand that you really need, you want to, all other things being equal, maximize the number of cards you're drawing. And that means that you don't play turns when you're doing these like reverse time... you don't do like 2 card turns where you're only playing 2 cards out of hand if you can play more cards. The other reason why the reverse time is problematic in this particular instance... Okay. So I'm going to roll back what I said earlier about keeping the Arise, because this is a great example of me having no experience playing this deck, Keith doing a thing with this deck that we had not seen at all in Game 1, and what Keith did here was actually an extremely good play. Keith played an Arise. He reverse timed his library into his graveyard, then played an Arise, basically allowing to play all of the disc creatures out of graveyard. So that was actually fantastic. Keith was 1 step ahead of me there, and I apologize. Now, there is an argument that the turn he took to set up there could have risked putting him further behind in the match, but the setup was well executed, and he did indeed get the arise off of a completely full discard pile. So that turned out to be pretty good. The problem is that Bhawk has the answer, which is Hysteria. Now that's just a stall for one turn, except that he has. So here, what the excellent play here is probably to hold Gateway. This is one of the few times you want to hold a card like Gateway. So he's going to probably discard Keyhammer. He plays Control the Weak to force him to Logos. I don't know that I would have done that. Well, yeah, I guess I probably would have, because if you saw Restoring Guntus, you can't hold Gateway and run the risk that Keith is going to Restoring Guntus for Dis, and then you won't be able to play Gateway until you find the Phase Shift or kill Restoring Guntus. So he played Control the Weak, 2 Logos, although he has an Ember Imp. So these are the considerations, right? If you think that your opponent has no answers in Dis to the Ember Imp, like can't kill the Ember Imp, then Control the Weaking to Dis when he doesn't have any answers, and playing an Ember Imp means that he would only get to play 2 Dis creatures. But now he's going to be able to play a full Dis turn later once he kills the Ember Imp. So that's tough. I don't know. That's a tough call. There are good arguments on both sides, but yeah. No, I guess you control the weak to Logos there, because you just don't want him to start spewing Dis stuff on the board. So he's allowed him. So now he's got a board advantage, but now Keith is going to play the Dis turn, right? Keith is going to drop all the Dis creatures on board again that we've seen, and we'll see what the Restoring Guntus call is. It's probably going to be Dis, because that's what was done before in this matchup. That's what they did before. They Restoring Guntus to protect against the Gateway, and then they got hit by the Phase Shift in hand. Well, this is fascinating. So Keith, perhaps attempting to play around the Gateway, is calling Brobnar, pulling his archive. So he does have more cards in archive, right? He can Reap, used Anger to kill off the Ember Imp. He's then going to play the rest of the Brobnar cards in hand. So this is a thing. Again, the problem is that these cards are face up to Bhawk. He put them all in his hand, so he knows what these cards are. So he's just holding this Gateway until he plays all the Dis creatures. And he's got other plays, right? It gets really interesting if for some reason he didn't call Dis and play all these creatures, because then he'd have to decide whether he wants to put all the... Then Bhawk would have to decide whether he wants to put all the Shadows creatures on board just to Gateway them the next turn. But obviously there's no other feasible route here for Keith other than to play all of these Dis creatures out of hand. Especially since the Charette will take Bhawk off check here. Bhawk's at 6, so he'll take Bhawk off check. Yeah, I think that's what you're going to see happen here. The most interesting play, although I don't know that it's very easy for Keith to find, the most interesting play is to bait the Gateway out. There are 16 cards left in the library, so he can't put Gateway in his hand. Keith can't put Gateway in Bhawk's hand. But if for some reason he knew he had Gateway, he could bait out the Gateway by playing everything except the Restoring Guntus. And then, based on this discard pile, which has almost no shadows in it whatsoever, Keith could then play Restoring Guntus for shadows the following turn. Now that's a good play when we see the hand's heads up here. That is a very hard play to find when you're at the table and have no idea if he has in his hand. Because if he tries that and he doesn't have Gateway in his hand, he's basically just chained himself with a Restoring Guntus. So I doubt that he will actually do that, but we'll see in a moment. He's going to play the Ember Imp, and the question is, does he play the Restoring Guntus? I think the answer is probably yes, but it gets real interesting if he doesn't. What you gonna do, Keith? He's thinking about it. I'll tell you what, give him credit for thinking about it. Because I'm not even sure it's the statistically correct play to do, given that there are 16 cards left in the deck. There's only one Gateway in Bhawk's deck. He does not know if he has the Gateway in his hand. So it's kind of a weird thing to do if he doesn't have the Gateway in hand. But the fact that he's thinking about it clearly illustrates the levels on which these players are processing the game. This is high-level gameplay. He's going to choose to play it, which I think is totally fine. Given that he can't see his opponent's hand. Now, the only problem is that he Restringuntus it for Logos because that was the only way on board to kill Restringuntus. But then he just comes back with the Gateway library play, and then he's going to drop all the Shadows creatures next turn. So this is going to likely be a situation of Gateway versus counter Gateway. Bhawk bemoaning his luck at being Gatewayed there, but oh, wait. I'm sorry. Bhawk bemoaning his luck at Keith drawing the second Arise. Yeah, that is pretty bad luck. So now he's going to play all of the disc creatures again. So there are 2 Arises. The 2 Arises really get you in this deck. Yeah. Bhawk thinking that this game might be over. It's not over, strictly speaking, as we know, but the 2 Ember Imps on board do present a major problem. So what Bhawk is going to have to do... Oh, if he calls Shadows now, this game is... Yep. That is almost a complete and total lockout. That is absolutely brutal. So very good call by Keith on the Restringuntus Shadows lockout here. And now we see why Restringuntus is such a good card when it's in the hands of a player who's paying attention to the board state. Because now Bhawk, all he can do is call Dis, use a library, archive a discard, and pass. And he drew another Archive of Shadows card, excuse me. He drew another Shadows card. So this feels very bad. Feel very bad for Bhawk here, who is left with very few options. But now, and meanwhile Keith is just reaping for 5 every turn, playing more things. You're reaping for 6. Discard the Gateway, please. No, you got to discard. I mean, whatever. It's on the margins. In fact, keeping the Gateway is probably fine because any scenario in which you would need the Gateway, something very bad would have happened. So I don't really mind keeping the Gateway in this situation where you're so far ahead. And so Bhawk's luck there has just gone completely sour. He archived another card and drew even more Shadows cards. And that is it. So what we saw a very interesting game there. We saw a situation where very interesting game. We saw a situation where one deck won both matchups, and then the opposing player chose to bid 0 chains on the deck in Game 3 in an adaptive match. And then they won. They beat the deck that won the game both matches. So we'll see if either one... I'll see if either... See if either one of the competitors want to join us in chat. But we'll see what happens. We'll see if they're going to join us in chat. But I mean that's going to set Keith up with a finals matchup with the winner of the previous semi, who was I'm trying to figure out. I totally apologize. I think it was Gnome. I think Gnome is the one that beat Nathan. So they're not able. Just a second. Sorry for the dead air for a second. I'm asking them to talk to me about chain bidding. Um, and because that was one of the more interesting parts of the match. I mean, all the parts of the match were interesting, but it was particularly interesting to watch the chain bidding because we saw a situation um, where they bid zero. You see a zero bid. Yes, Gnome. Excuse me. Gnome was the finalist from the other match. So Keith will now play Gnome in the finals. Um, so Keith is saying in chat that the reason that he chose to bid uh, zero chains in the chain bidding process was um, that he was lucky. He knew that his deck would match up well against Bhawk's deck if it was lucky. If he had a reasonably lucky draw. He did not get a good draw in game one. He did get a good draw in game three. He can't ask for a better hand in game three. And I'm saying that yeah, that hand was definitely a good one. So we can't just so we right. So he mulliganed because he couldn't reverse time and arise because he didn't have enough cards in discard on turn one. That's a good point. I'm just telling him that I will admit I didn't see the arise play coming initially because that was because I haven't played a lot of decks. Because I haven't played a lot of decks with Arise and that combo. But that's all about what adaptive is all about. I should have just gatewayed and said goodbye to my Shadows board. Bhawk, which game are you talking about? Hells Y is saying I played against this deck. I'm telling him I have the memory of a goldfish and I can't remember. He said Ellis. I'm saying I miscalled the original gateway of the original reverse time arise deck, and Alice Y saying I played this deck against you in the league because I was in this league as well. I and did not make the top cut, but I was in the league. I played all these players, and I'm telling him I can't remember anything. I'm very surprised that I remembered anything about this at all, and that was like a month ago. Bhawk is saying that game two, he thinks that there were several turns he should have just reaped with his board. Yeah, and Keith is asking if he had the gateway in hand when he hysterias. Yeah, that was interesting. Double hysteria, control the weak gateway, Amber Rip. Yeah, that was a fun point in the match for sure. They're just sorry. Apologies to the viewers. I'm just trying to kind of narrate and explain what's happening in chat and the conversations we're having. So they're discussing the point in time when when Bhawk had gateway, hysteria, control the weak, Ember Imp in hand. And the Restringuntus. The Restringuntus lock at the end is obviously brutal. How I'll ask. I'm asking Keith how often um, he's won by lock with the deck. By lock, I mean by Restringuntus lock. Because that's definitely a win con that I will personally admit I have not a lot of experience with. I totally understand it. I just haven't played a lot of competitive decks that had a Restringuntus lock in it. So that's one of the things I've been personally kind of having more experience with recently through this process. Is a great benefit of something like an adaptive tournament. It teaches you, sees all sorts of new decks. You play with different win cons they are not used to. Wow, okay, so Keith is saying about half the time that he's won by lock or some version of lock that where it doesn't matter. So he's won by having a board advantage where the lock was so it was so close to a virtual lock there was enough of a stall on his opponent that his opponent could not progress further. Um, Yes, and he's saying this is a good example of a quasi lock. I mean, this is a pretty close to complete lock because he can use library, but that's pretty much it. So I mean, calling like when you're down 6 creatures to nothing on the board, and you have forced him to call Library of the Damned, archive a card, and hope that you draw one additional answer. It's just pretty much you're dead. Um, and then Bhawk is pointing out that it actually was a complete lock because he couldn't even Library of the Damned because of Tentacus, which is silly. I didn't even think about that. I mean, it didn't matter whether or not he could Library of the Damned again because he was so Keith was so far ahead and there was nothing that Bhawk could draw into anyway. But he couldn't even use Library of the Damned uh, because of this card, because of Tentacus. So it was just a crazy thing. Um, so I'm asking Keith what his thoughts are about playing Gnome in the finals, because that's coming up soon. Um, and we'll see what he says. That is going to be your finals matchup. What is the password to watch on Crucible? I apologize. Sorry, Hyde Gank. I just saw your question. DoK is the password. However, the match has concluded. DoK, lowercase DoK, is always the password for all league events. It's not meant, we have a password not because it's meant to keep anyone out from watching. It's always lowercase d, lowercase o, lowercase k. The reason we have a password is because if you don't have one on Crucible, a lot of times people will just do like quick join and they'll pop into your game without intending to join, and it'll be like a league match, and then you got to restart the game. So that's why we have a password, but it's always the same password. It's always DOK. Anyone watching those matches can always join in. So that is what the password is. That's what the password is for our league matches. Keith is saying in chat that he thinks that the deck does well against Gnome, but it doesn't matter because it's an adaptive match, which is absolutely correct. It makes no difference whatsoever whether or not a deck is better or worse against a particular deck. It just matters that you understand it in an adaptive match because you'll have a chance to play both decks. Keith is also saying that the deck that he's playing does not do well against Galaxy. Galaxy was Nathan's deck that we saw Nathan play in the semifinals of the matchup where he lost to Gnome. Galaxy is a very good deck that Nathan has successfully piloted to a 5-0 day one start at the Denver Vault Tour. Galaxy's a hard control and it's rushy as well. It goes very fast. So it's a very good deck. And I said, to be fair, nothing really works well against Galaxy anyway. But again, it's an adaptive match, so it doesn't matter. It is better to read as letters while listening to a stream. DOK. I'm sorry, Hyde Gank. I guess I don't completely understand when you say better to read as letters. I don't know what you're referring to reading, whether it's the password or chat. I apologize, but um, I'm telling them thanks for competing. It was a fun match to watch. Keith is saying no chain in Game 3 is pretty natural. Yeah, I in stream that my max bid was 3, 4. Oh, hard to read the cards. Oh, no problem, Hide Gank. I was just trying to understand what you meant. I said that in stream was my max bid was 3, 4, the deck, but 0 is definitely possible. Definitely understandable. Yeah, and I apologize for the cards. So the thing is, I can probably I'll show you the problem that after they're still chatting. I don't want to change it right now, but just so you know, the reason why I don't have cards a lot bigger than this, I try to focus on a card like this when I'm pulling it up. But the reason why I don't have cards a lot bigger than this on stream is because if they start overlapping, then you can't see the entire board, and so it's harder to call the action and have it understood. That being said, I will definitely take your advice. I'll try the next stream I do. I'll maybe start out by having the cards at a higher res in the Crucible, and maybe that'll make it slightly better for the viewer. That's a very fair point. I was just trying to make sure that the viewer could see everything on the board when you have artifacts and creatures and other creatures and artifacts. You have that sort of thing. Okay, so the final thoughts that I've asked for in chat, they're saying Keith is saying he felt he wasn't lucky in Game 1, but was close enough. It was a tough comeback in Game 2 by a thread. And Bhawk is actually saying he would have passed for one chain if Keith had bid one chain. So both players agreed that they wanted Keith's deck. Keith just got his first right to it because he could pass on the 0 chain. Bhawk is saying he abused reverse time. He thought he was digging for my lash or other answers, but instead he was just getting a heavy dose of deja vu. That's fair. It can be cool to play with the same cards if they're good enough, and Keith, of course, correctly noting that neither deck has excellent Amber control in this particular matchup, or just in general. That Keith is correctly noting that in this matchup, if either deck gets substantially far ahead, there's no mass Amber steal. They don't have too much to protect. They don't have any other major steely cards. So it's not a situation where Keith has a lot of outs, or either player has a lot of outs. So they're forced in a situation where they have to immediately deal with the board, and if they can't immediately deal with the board, then they're going to have a major problem, which is why the combination of Gateway and 2 Arises, plus all of this disc stuff, Restring Guntus, the Charette, the Ember Imp, the Tentacus, Schuler, all of that double Ember Imp is super, super strong when you are playing a matchup that is incredibly board dependent. Even though both players have a Gateway, when you have 2 Arises and all of those disc creatures, and an ability to throw them all in discard immediately and get them on play, it's a very good combo. And Bhawk is saying they make for great adaptive decks because they know how to play with them, and they require a lot of understanding. I'm saying I totally agree with those comments, as I even misunderstood or miscalled some lines in the cast because I didn't see what you did at the time. Yeah, so this is the beauty of adaptive, right? I mean, like this is why no matter how good or bad a deck is, and there are certainly some decks that are just objectively never going to be very competitive, and there are some decks that are always going to be very competitive and don't require an immense amount of strategy, but the vast majority of decks lie in the middle, and this is an excellent lesson about why adaptive is a great way to hone your skills, and why adaptive is the format which is primarily used, at least in the US, as the final round of all the Vault Tours, whether it's Sealed Adaptive or Archon Adaptive, depending upon the Vault Tour. This is why adaptive is used, because understanding your decks, playing your decks, having experience with your decks, and saying thanks to the players for playing, but having experience with your decks and playing with your decks, and knowing them better than your opponent does, is a distinct advantage, especially if your deck requires a great deal of finesse or has a lot of important, nuanced plays to make in order to determine the best line. Right, you have to make a lot of incremental decisions. That makes a deck a great reversal deck. So the winning player here was Keith. Technically, Keith's deck only won one match, but it was the one that mattered the most. It was Game 3. And Keith was playing Shin Fighter. So this is Shin Fighter. This is the deck that we saw. And you heard me earlier in the cast, if you were watching, blaze through very quickly, because Keith is right, I played this deck. He played this deck against me, I don't know, a month ago, and I can't remember things very well, so I did not remember it. But he's 100% correct that this is not a deck that if you don't have experience playing or watching being played, you don't automatically see it. And the double reverse time, double arise is brutal when you have the right disc creatures in graveyard, right? Being able to reverse time early on, then arise, and then Charette, Ember Imp, Restaurant Schuler, Tentacus. So it's just incredibly annoying to play against, and it's very difficult to beat if you don't have answers on time and when you're supposed to have them and in the right format. So the reality of this match is that I was going to say Keith knew his deck better, but it sounded like Bhawk had a very good hold on what Keith's deck was. Bhawk was just put in the unenviable position where both players wanted Keith's deck in Game 3 because Bhawk was forced to bid on the deck first. He bid on the deck first, on his deck first, bid 0 as he's required to do, and then Keith just had the option to pass and take his deck in the final. You don't see that very often in a reversal tournament, but obviously the correct analysis was made by both players, and the variance leveled out, and Keith's deck prevailed in the end. And reverse time is notorious pre-errata for being a good mechanism to library access reverse time in order to play library access and loop off sooner. You can also combine it with time travelers, but this unique combination, reverse time, arise, double reverse time, double arise, is an extremely good combination that yields very good results in terms of you being able to recur your deck into your graveyard and go through everything. And just taking one last look at Bhawk's deck, Drab, Mirabelle. Again, there were a lot of things in here that we saw on initial evaluation, but even things that we did not necessarily see that ended up being very important. It's not as significant as the reverse time arise combo, but it's still very important because the phase shifts in this deck are exceedingly important. You saw Keith get out of, in Game 2, I believe it was, Keith got out of a lock, a Restringuntus lock, that was correctly played for Dis, but he happened to have one of the phase shifts in hand, so he phase shift into Gateway, clearing the board and allowing himself to eke back into the match. That probably, if there was a single turn that got Keith into the final game, that caused Keith to win Game 2, if there was a single turn that did it, it probably was that turn. I'd have to go back and confirm if I wanted to be 100% sure, but that I remember that happening in real life. And that was in real time rather, and that was a very distinctive turn that caused a big swing in control of the game. So we will be seeing sometime in the near future where I will be casting for you the finals between Gnome and Keith. Keith playing Shin Fighter of the Lady General's Crad, which is just a funny name in general, but a very good deck, even better in a reversal format. I'd have to think about it, but my instinct is that this, because of the low amber control, in an open field, it probably doesn't fare that well. The deck's rating indicates that unless this was in a triad, Keith has not played this deck in a Vault Tour Archon event. Because they would have if it were a single deck Archon, they would have more wins losses. There'd be a total of 6 wins or losses. So he's played this. My guess is at 1 Chainbound, producing a 3-1 result. It's a good deck. I don't know that he'd want to play it in a Vault Tour Archon deck because it would get run over by a lot of Amber Rush / control decks. However, it is a very good deck for adaptive. This deck is probably, of all the decks I've seen, this might be the prototype for adaptive play. Good enough to be competitive and complicated enough and nuanced enough so that the player who understands this deck better is going to have a major advantage in an adaptive match. And you saw that here today. Great match by 2 excellent players. So we're going to end the cast there today. Feel free to follow my channel for more content. I'm going to get all this up all on YouTube soon, so we'll be able to see that not only on Twitch but on YouTube as well with the same screen name. Thank you guys all for watching. If you have any other questions, feel free to drop me a line. I have the same Discord and Twitch handles, Justice Blinded, and we will have more excellent Keyforge content, including the finals of this tournament, to you very soon. Thanks, and keep forging.